We are now going to take our first bite of Daniel chapter 8. There's quite a lot of food in this chapter to feast upon. A lot of interesting details to savour and to explore. But I'm going to leave that to a later feast. Right now, we're going to just have a bit of an hors d'oeuvre, if you like, an appetizer, an introduction to this great chapter. It is, however, a very disturbing chapter, and you can see from the very way the chapter ends that it shook Daniel to the core. For he says, I, Daniel, was exhausted and lay sick for several days. Then I got up and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding. So this is a vision that is highly relevant to the very uncertain times in which we find ourselves living, with the coronavirus wreaking havoc around the world, claiming tens of thousands of lives and no doubt many more to come. For this chapter is a chapter about major future upheavals and about many terrible things that will happen in the future. It's a chapter which deeply disturbs Daniel, because Daniel had been hoping very much for a better world. We know from his prayer in Daniel 9 that Daniel was very mindful of the promises that God had made through Jeremiah, that after 70 years he would intervene to take his people from this horrible time in captivity under the thumb of the Babylonians, and he would restore them to their own land and enable them to rebuild their temple and to rebuild their own lives. And so understandably, Daniel was rather hoping that this would usher in a wonderful new age for God's people, a wonderful future. This vision occurs in the third year of Belshazzar, after the vision he'd had before, which is recorded in the previous chapter, in the first year of Belshazzar, which had already indicated to Daniel it wasn't going to work out quite like that. There was some messy stuff that lay in the future. And this chapter just rubs salt into the wound. There are terrible things that lie ahead, especially for God's people. And for all the hope and confidence they have that rebuilding the temple would result in wonderful things, even that is going to get damaged and defiled. And the world is going to come crashing down again. No wonder Daniel is feeling deeply disturbed. This chapter is actually written in Hebrew, which you might not think is that remarkable, but it so happens that from early on in chapter 2 right through to the end of chapter 7, the language of Aramaic has been used, which is sort of the court language of Babylon, where we've been invited to enter, as it were, the Babylonian world, with chapter 7 acting kind of as transition from that into what we now have. From chapters 8 to 12 in Hebrew, the language of the Jewish people themselves, because now, in a very focused and concerted manner, we are going to be considering what the future holds for the Jewish people themselves and for their worship of God, the temple. And it's not a good future, or so it seems. There's a lot of pain, a lot of hurt, a lot of horrific things are going to happen. Of course, in the first instance, the biggest change that's going to occur is the ride of the Medo-Persian Empire, referred to in verse 20 and portrayed by the ram that it seems to be so powerful and nobody can stand against it. And the ram, of course, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Empire, as it's sometimes called, just simply the Persian Empire. It brought about, didn't it, the fall of Babylon in 539 BC. And indeed, Daniel chapter 5 portrays for us the very night on which that occurred, and when Belshazzar met his miserable and highly deserved end. And the rise of the Medo-Persian Empire in many ways was a very positive development for God's people, because then Cyrus, the king of Persia, issues his famous decree, which enabled the people of God to return to their land and rebuild their temple. Oh, if history would just stabilise and enable such a state of affairs to be perpetuated. But that's not the world we live in, is it? It's a world of constant change, constant uncertainty. That's the real world. And so the vision continues with the frightening prospect of the Medo-Persian Empire being trampled upon by the goat. The two-horned ram, two horns of course representing the Medes and the Persians, with one horn longer than the other, namely the Persians, dominating the Medes in a sense and being the ones through whom this empire is described. Anyway, the Persian Empire is trampled upon by the rise of Alexander the Great's Greek Empire. And he crosses the whole earth without touching the ground. That's the way the goat's described, isn't it? Because Alexander the Great began a set of conquests which almost took in the whole world of the day. And he did it so quickly, so easily. Indeed, within the space of just 3 years, between 334 to 331 BC, he ravaged the Persian Empire, the battles of Granicus and Issus and Gaugamela, 331 BC. He brought the Persian Empire to its knees, trampled it, destroyed it. And the Greek Empire then took over. But then that prominent horn is broken down too, isn't it? Just at the height of its power. Alexander the Great himself dies just a few years later, 328 BC. He's only 32 years of age and he's dead. And then we're told, aren't we, that 4 horns rise from that. And that represents, I guess, the way in which the Greek Empire, following the death of Alexander the Great and the civil wars that ensued, it divided up into 4 sections. There was the Ptolemaic Egyptian kingdom in the south, and referred to as the king of the south in Daniel chapter 11. There was the Seleucid Mesopotamian part in the north, referred to as the king of the north in Daniel 11. And then we've also got 2 other sections. There was the Attalid Anatolia kingdom, and there was the Antigonid Macedonian kingdom also that eventuated. But the ones of particular interest to us are the ones that had special impact upon the beautiful land, the land of Palestine, where God's people were living, namely the king of the south, the king of the north, the Ptolemaic kingdom, and the Seleucid kingdom. And the thing about the rise of the Greek Empire, which is especially disturbing, which had flow-on effects, was that it brought to the world what we now call Hellenistic culture or Greek culture, Greek ways of thinking and Greek ways of acting. Now, of course, that continues to have a massive impact on our modern world, doesn't it? And we know that during the 15th and 16th centuries, during what we call the Renaissance, that Greek culture was revived and had an immense impact upon art and architecture, but even more so upon our culture and our worldview. And I guess many of those influences have been reasonably positive, but it's also been highly damaging as well, isn't it? Because it's a worldview which has encouraged people to think that we can make a better world for ourselves, a better life for ourselves by depending upon our own intelligence and reason rather than upon God. And indeed, that's what lies behind the way in which the vision becomes even more frightening in Daniel chapter 8. Because from that whole nexus of kingdoms that came out of the Greek Empire, there rises this little horn that starts off small, but then grows in power, and which is really the main focus of this vision, because it is more directed towards damaging the people of God. It's going to come to the beautiful land, and it's going to seek to destroy the whole worship system of the Jewish people. And it's going to seek to destroy the people of God themselves if they won't play along with what this king wants. Now we will see, when we take a further bite at this at some later stage, that this little horn is particularly fulfilled, at least immediately, in a figure that arose in the 2nd century BC, a guy called Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who represented the Seleucid Empire up in the north, the king of the north. And he did absolutely horrific things during his time, particularly around 168 BC. He died about 164 BC. So that's what the main focus of the chapter is going to be on, but we're not really going to get too much into that at this stage. The story is told, isn't it, of the frog and the princess. The standard way in which the story goes is that you've got this beautiful princess, she kisses the frog, turns into a handsome prince, and they get married and live happily ever after. There's a sense in which the people of God are somewhat amphibious. They've been living in their own land, and now, more lately, they are in the swamp of Babylon and learning to survive there. And there's this hope, isn't there, that the kiss of God will turn them into something it's a beautiful land, and maybe they'll be a beautiful people, and they'll live happily ever after. Well, the story is also told of the frog who consulted a fortune teller and wondered what the future held for him. And the fortune teller told the frog, well, you will meet a beautiful princess. And he said, oh, in what context will this happen? Will it be at some palace banquet or something like that? And the fortune teller said, no, it will be in the biology class. And there's a sense in which this vision is frightening and disturbing, because it's as though God's people end up in the biology class of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. When we get to look at this a bit more closely, there are indications in this chapter that we shouldn't just simply be thinking of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, that this chapter is pointing to further fulfillments of what's envisaged here, which go well beyond just that particular person. But nevertheless, there's a sense in which the future is really bad for God's people. Now, it so happened that last year, Jeremy Hunt, who's the British Secretary of Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, commissioned an independent investigation into the persecution of Christians worldwide. And that independent study showed that around 1 billion Christians are currently being persecuted around the world. Now we know the rain falls on the just and the unjust. We know that persecution is not just limited to Christians. There are others who get persecuted. We think of the Uyghurs at the moment in China, terribly persecuted. We think of the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, terribly persecuted. However, many Christians also persecuted in Myanmar as well. That doesn't tend to get into the news quite as much. But anyway, we know that there are other groups that certainly experience persecution. But this investigation revealed that no less than 80% of all those who suffer religious persecution around the world are Christians. So Jesus really was telling it like it is when he said, the world will hate you because it hates me. And when we look at the expressions of hostility worldwide, we do find there's an edge to it. That they're particularly pointed at God's people. And that's what we find in this chapter, isn't it? There's a particular direction of this hostility towards the people of God. Now, Jesus told us himself, didn't he, that that's the way history's always going to be until he winds things up as the Son of Man coming in his glory. We read about this in Luke 21. You can compare that with Matthew 24 and Mark 13. You look at Luke 21, Jesus says, doesn't he, that beyond the fall of Jerusalem, which was the most immediate thing that was going to happen again in the future, beyond that, kingdom would rise against kingdom, nation against nation. There'd be great earthquakes and famines and pestilences like coronavirus and fearful events and great signs from heaven. That's Luke 21. I think it's around verses 10, 11, something like that. That's the future. But we recognise that there's always going to be this particular edge. And that we as God's people need to be realistic about the future. We might hope for a better world like Daniel did. But we just need to bear in mind that in this fallen world, Christians, God's people, are going to continue to suffer, sometimes in horrific ways, until the Lord winds it all up. So that's the first thing. But then we look at Daniel, don't we, who was utterly appalled by this vision. And what does he do? Well, he's miserable for a while. He lays sick for a few days, but then he gets up and he's about the king's business. And of course, we see Daniel and his friends doing this right through the book of Daniel. They continue to be faithful servants of whatever king it is. And that's what we have to do. We need to be faithful, don't we? And just keep on pressing on serving the Lord. Of course, Daniel 8 is also indicating that although there's a terrible future lies ahead, God is in control of it. And when he knows already what's going to happen, he can tell you. But he's put a time limit on it, 2,300 evenings and mornings, which I'll have to explain at some later stage. And it'll come to an end, and then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated. There'll be a time when God again will dwell with his people. And of course, for us, we know that ultimately that's going to be in a new heavens and a new earth, and that's what we long for. But already, because of Jesus' death and resurrection, the Holy Spirit is being poured out, and we ourselves have been made the temple of God. And God dwells with us now, so we already have a rich foretaste of that reality. So we have every reason, despite the doom and gloom that characterizes fallen human history. This is an evil age. That's why the way the Bible talks about it. Nevertheless, we have great reasons for hope and confidence and every encouragement to continue to serve the Lord faithfully in whatever sphere of life and set of relationships he's placed us.